All right, Steven Pressfield, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Brett, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you got a new novel out, A Man at Arms. And what makes this novel unique, it's your first novel set in the ancient world. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners read like Gates of Fire, The Virtues of War. This is your first novel set in the ancient world in over 13 years. So my first question is, why has it been so long since you've written a book set in ancient Rome or ancient Greece? And what was it about this story that made you decide, this is it, I got to write another novel set in the ancient world?
Well, I was having coffee with a friend of mine, like about 13 years ago, whatever it was, so another writer, and he was making fun of me, or he was saying, how are you going to kill the next person in your book? Are you going home to worry, is it a spear? Is it a sword? Is it, do you knife them? Whatever it is. And I said to myself, maybe I've been too long in this area and I should get into the modern world a little bit. So I decided, okay, I'm going to shift and write stuff that's more contemporary for a while. Because I also didn't want to get sort of typecast as only being in the ancient world. But I missed it, and I missed the effects that you can produce when you use kind of, let's say, more noble language that you can do when you're writing in the ancient world. And I wanted to tell the story of this one character, Telamon. It's a recurring character in 3 of my other books. And I was just, it takes a long time, Brett, to find a story sometimes. You try and you try and try, you just can't find one. And finally, a couple of years ago, I did find it, and it was great fun to do a book that was only about this one character, a favorite character of mine, Telamon, and also to get back into the ancient world.
Well, so the basic story is that Telamon, he's a former Roman legionnaire, and this is around the time when the early Christian movement was just starting.
Right.
And he decides to team up. So, that's how it ends up, but teaming up with some Christian messengers who were carrying epistles for the Apostle Paul. Where did that come from? That's just seems out of left field.
It's the long backstory is my niece got married a couple of years ago, and she asked me to be the officiant at the ceremony. Actually, my brother had already secretly married them, and I was going to be the public face of this. So I went to the Book of Common Prayer to try to put together my own little, traditional type of whatever you wanted to call it, a service, whatever. And everything that I fell in love with came out of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians. We see through a glass darkly, and faith, hope, and charity, and all those wonderful, great quotes. And that just sort of stuck in my mind. And, things percolate. And as a writer, you're always looking for some hook to hang a story on. And I thought, this is a great thing. This letter, that it actually was a real letter that had to be delivered, and that the Romans were trying to stop it. And they made perfect bad guys for a kind of an action chase story that would have real depth to it, that would really be about things on the soul level and not just on the action level. So that's how the story came together, Brett.
And I'm curious, how did you go about researching the book? Because writing about Christianity can be tricky because it's so part of our culture. If you grew up in the West, the story basically. So it's hard to get at it in a different angle. But what I liked about reading A Man at Arms is that oftentimes I felt like I wasn't reading a book about Christianity. I was like reading like a work of political fiction where I was able to see how the Romans or even the Jews looked at or viewed this early movement. So, first, how did you research that? And was that what you're trying to convey? You're trying to look at the Christian movement from a different perspective?
Yes. I certainly do not consider this a book about Christianity by any means. If anything, I would say it was a kind of a political thriller or an action story. It really is more about the movement of early Christianity as seen through the eyes of Rome, of the Empire of Rome, and as seen as a threat, as something that they have to deal with, which it really was. And rather than until the very end of the story, which I don't want to give anything away, only then does it really get into kind of the spiritual aspects. But I definitely felt like I was telling a kind of a political story of a movement that was a threat to an empire and the empire's moves to crush that movement.
And can you give us, like a taste of what that world looked like, the way you describe in your book?
Well, one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that early Christianity was a threat not just to the Roman Empire, but to the Jewish community, to the kingdom of Israel at the time, Judea, because it threatened to split and weaken the Jewish community which was under tremendous oppression from Rome and needed to be as united as it possibly could. So that there were a number of elements, bad guys, trying to stop this growing faith. And at that time, the story is set like maybe 20 years after the crucifixion. So it's really about the primary engine of fledgling Christianity at this point was the Apostle Paul, who was sort of the paramount proselytizer, the paramount push behind expanding it into the various communities around the world.
And I like the way you describe that from like the Roman perspective. Oftentimes the generals, when they talked about the Christians, they didn't even like call them Christians. They just called them like the Messianic Jews. Like they were just like a crazy branch of Judaism.
Yes. Because I think that's exactly what it was. It wasn't thought of as this new thing called Christianity. It was just sort of these crazy Jews, this crazy offshoot of Jews that believed in another world and that had tremendous faith and that, really had the type of belief and the type of passion that could threaten an empire.
Like what was threatening about it? I mean, can they just be like, well, these are kind of wackadoos, just ignore them? Like what do you think the threat was?
Well, the threat was that it was so expansionist that its home was really not in this world. Its home was in the kingdom of heaven. And so anybody that you can see it in passionate movements today too, where someone, where the group, the collective kind of breaks mentally and emotionally breaks out of the concerns of the material world and is concerned with another world, a world beyond this world. And so is willing to undergo sacrifices and give up their lives and et cetera, et cetera. And also at the time, I think early Christianity among the people who were following it was an absolute sensation in terms of the passion that it aroused. And I think that Rome felt, and I say this in the book, I put this in the mouths of one of the tribunes, that the emperor's sleep was not troubled by other armies, but rather a new faith, something that people could believe in beyond this world. That was a real threat. And in fact, that's what did bring down the Roman Empire, so that the Vatican is now in Rome, right? I mean, it became the seat of Christianity, the very heart of the empire.
And the other interesting thing about the Christian movement, like they were using the empire to further their aims, right? Like Paul, they were able to reason why Paul's able to like connect with all these different groups, because like Rome, the empire, had built all these roads and shipping lines, and they were using that to spread their message.
Yes, that was a kind of a delicious irony of the thing, that the very modern inventions that Rome had brought, the roads that they built, the mail, this was what the apostle used to further his message and get it out there. So Rome was sort of, complicit in its own demise in that sense.
Well, let's talk about Telamon. So you mentioned this was a character from previous books. What other books did he make an appearance in?
He was in Tides of War, which was set during the Peloponnesian War. Then he came back unchanged and unaged, not 100 years later, as a mentor to Alexander in my book, The Virtues of War. And then I even gave him a cameo in a book called The Profession that's actually set in our contemporary future, about 20 years in the future. But that was a little tiny thing. But he was in two books where, 70, 80 years apart, where he had not aged a day. And then in this new one, in A Man at Arms, it's another few hundred years later, and he hasn't aged a day either.
And what's going on there? Like, I think that's interesting. You'd have a character who's the same guy, but he shows up in different time periods.
I mean, to me, Brett, it's kind of interesting because it's nothing I particularly planned. I didn't say, oh, I'm going to have this character in one book and again. But once I sort of started doing that, it seemed to really make great sense to me. To me, Telamon is sort of the supreme archetype of the warrior, but he is also the universal soldier in the sense that he appears in century after century unchanged, just like war is a universal constant in the human race. And warriors don't change either. So he is one of these, he's the universal soldier to me who appears over and over again. And of course, the next question is why? Did he commit some terrible crime in the past that has to pay for by doing this? And I don't even know the answer to that. But I just see him as stuck in this archetype and sort of condemned to live it over and over.
And what's interesting about Telamon in A Man at Arms is that, okay, he's a former legionnaire. And in the Roman army, they're like a legionnaire, you had a career. Like you serve for a certain amount of time, then you got some land, you basically were able to take it easy. But he doesn't do that once his service is up. He decides to become a mercenary. What do you think's going on there? Why didn't he fall? Is it just because he's that archetypical warrior? He has to keep fighting?
I think that's exactly it. That as he says in A Man at Arms, he was in the legions, but he was not of them. And that he never embraced, the eagle or the idea of Roman citizenship or the three-part name that Romans always took, or that, people might volunteer for the legions in Spain, let's say, or in Gaul, and they would not be Romans, they would be natives of that country. And they would, in essence, take on a Roman identity. They would change their name, kind of like in the French Foreign Legion, and they would take a Roman name and they would achieve Roman citizenship, and they would, essentially be faux Romans, or artificial Romans. And in their mind, of course, they were full-fledged Romans. And then they would go through their service, and as you said, they'd get maybe some land, or they would, have various bounties that they achieved over time and have some money. But Telamon is a guy who, from the previous two books of mine, is beyond all that. He doesn't care who he serves for. He doesn't care what the flag is. He is his goddess. The only goddess he worships is Ares, the Greek goddess of strife. And he is one of these guys who is a rare bird that he said, as he says, I fight for the fight alone. I serve for the serving alone. I tramp for the tramping alone. So he was definitely not a part of the legions in any emotional way. He was beyond that in his own mind. So when he got out, there was never a question that he would settle down and have a farm. He's continuing to serve the goddess Strife and moving on in his own way as a solitary individual. To me, he's kind of like a samurai that you see in the Ronin movies, where they were masterless samurai that were cut loose from the collective and were just on their own, kind of like a Western gunslinger in an American Western.
Yeah, or he's like a private eye, like a Humphrey Bogart type, like he has his own code. It's not the code of the state, but he's got his own code that he's going to follow no matter what.
Exactly, which is what makes him so interesting to me, and what makes him, I think, a very modern character. He's like a private eye. He's like a Clint Eastwood man with no name type of gunslinger. He's like the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca, an individual who has cut himself free from any collective beliefs, any flag, any cause, any leader, and is trying to navigate his way just as an individual, by his own code, which is constantly evolving as he has his various adventures. And
as you said, it's primarily like he's just drawn to fighting. Like he calls it, his philosophy is dust and strife. And as I was reading this, it's hard not to bring in some of the other stuff you've written about in your nonfiction about being an artist, being a writer, being a business person, an entrepreneur. Do you see any connection there? Like what you've written about in, say, like the War of Art to Telamon's dust and strife anti-hero philosophy?
Yes, absolutely. I feel like I have sort of two types of books that I write. One is a kind of a inner war type of book, like the War of Art, that's really about the mental and emotional world that an artist or an entrepreneur deals with. And the other are these novels that are usually set in the ancient world, and they're about the outer war, where the warfare becomes a metaphor, external warfare becomes a metaphor for the internal war. And one of the things that's really interesting to me about the character of Telamon is that he's fighting both. He is a physical warrior for whom violence is a way of life, but he's also a philosopher. And he's trying to fight his own internal war. As strong a character as he is as a warrior, he feels frustrated in that. He's like up against a wall, like he's exhausted that archetype. And much like, say the Humphrey Bogart character in Casablanca, or the Clint Eastwood character in various Westerns, or a lot of samurais, they can do their thing, they can win these fights, they can endure adversity, but they know in their hearts that something is missing, that they're kind of stuck. And this story, like Westerns or like samurai movies, is about bringing the warrior beyond that to the next level, which, involves a step into love. And that's where the Apostle Paul's letter comes into this whole story.
And tying this back into like your work with artists and entrepreneurs, like, do you see a lot of artists and entrepreneurs, like that's their philosophy? They take that sort of dust and strife philosophy when they first start out?
I think absolutely. And I think, that you almost have to, right? If you're an entrepreneur and you're launching a new business or a startup or something, or if you're an artist and you're writing a book or a movie, or you're a musician or whatever, you're alone. And the world is a hard, cruel world. And if you're going to break through that world, you kind of have to have an aggressive mindset, a warrior mindset. And it's also very much of an ego mindset. It's really a, us against the world type of environment, or mindset, just to kind of break through. But once you do break through, once you have established yourself somewhere, then the next question becomes, what am I going to do with this identity that I have, with this platform that I've achieved? Is it just about my own ego and pushing forward for more, money or whatever? Or is it actually about something? Do I really have some gift that I want to give to the world, or some message that I'd like to bring?
And one of the ways you flesh out the character of Telamon is he has an apprentice. And I'd say,
Yes.
I don't think Telamon is the kind of guy, like he's a lone gun. So of course he wouldn't want an apprentice. So rather this kid basically decided, Telamon, you're going to be my mentor, whether you like it or not. Tell us about this boy, and like, what can we learn about Telamon because of the boy's like attraction, like him wanting to be mentored by Telamon?
That's a great question, Brett. And this was almost an instinctive choice as a writer. I had the character of Telamon, and something made me say to myself, he needs an apprentice. He needs somebody that idolizes him, and also somebody that we can see the story through his eyes. And I was thinking, have you seen the movie Seven Samurai?
Yes.
The lead samurai at the very start of the movie has a young samurai attach himself to him. Do you remember that character?
Right.
Who goes all the way through he bows down to him. He says, "Please, sir, make me your apprentice. I want to learn from you." And I thought that was just a great way of getting into Telamon's character, because the way he teaches the apprentice is he never says anything. He just allows him to watch, or he says very few things. And of course, what was clear to me as a writer was that in the end, it was going to be the apprentice who winds up teaching the master, and that things would turn by the end. So that was the reason for the character of David, the young boy who follows Telamon.
And give some context, David, he comes from a really religious, like his religious Jewish family. So what, going the warrior path was like, yeah, that's not what you're supposed to do, but he still wanted to do that.
Yeah, he was definitely he came from like an impoverished family. He's illiterate, but very much felt the oppression of the Roman Empire on them, and very much felt that the Jewish community, as it stood at that time, was not strong enough to resist this thing. And so he himself, just kind of seeking manhood, seeking masculinity, if you want to use that word, which I do, sought out the most masculine character that he could find and attached himself to him, because he wanted to learn to stand up for himself and to stand up for the community.
And, Telamon, he could have just told this kid to take a hike or even killed him. It's like, you're just annoying me. But he doesn't. Why do you think that is? Have you figured that out? Or was Telamon just opening himself up to to change, or what do you think?
That's a great question, Brett. It's sort of like, have you ever read a book called Save the Cat?
I have not.
By Blake Snyder. It's a wonderful book. There's like 3 or 4 of these books. It's about screenwriting. It's about writing movies. And Blake Snyder is a screenwriter, or was. He died tragically at a young age. But one of the things that the idea behind Save the Cat is that any hero in a story needs to do something early in the story that makes us in the audience think that he's a good guy or a good gal. And the Save the Cat is Blake Snyder's way of doing that. The hero should save a cat or something like that, do something nice. Because most heroes in stories, if you think about gunslingers or samurais or private eyes or any of these kind of classic hard-bitten heroes, most of them are really tough hombres that it's hard to like. And a lot of them, violence is their first gesture in anything, their first option. So to let us, the viewer, into the story, you sort of need to have a little bit of a something that shows, this guy has a little bit of a soft spot anywhere. But also, more important than that, I mean, I knew with Telamon at the start of the story that he was going to seem to be the all-time hardcore, badass guy. But by the end of the story, he was going to have switched and come all the way over to a position of love. So I wanted along the way for us to see that even beneath his crusty, hard exterior, he does have compassion and he can feel for somebody and take on this young boy. I mean, to do that was really a real gesture of empathy and a real kind gesture. And I think that made a lot of sense that would then come out later in the story as we got to know Telamon completely.
I'm curious, in your own life, have there been situations where you were David, the boy looking for that mentor, or when you were Telamon and you've had a young person like, show me the ways? Have you experienced that personally?
That's another great question, Brett. I mean, I definitely have had both. And if I would say one was more predominant, it's that I've had mentors. And I've had many mentors where I was in the position of being the apprentice and that have been absolutely invaluable to me. Could not have done, anything that I've done without them. So, yeah, I think that's a huge part of our evolution. I'm sure it's true for you too, that you find yourself taking people under your wing from time to time and also reaching out to mentors that can guide you and give you some feedback along the journey that we're all on.
Well, did you have a mentor that stood out to you? Like that was like really kind of that Telamon, like really crusty and grouchy, but you learned a lot from him?
I've had many, but I'll tell you one. In my 20s, I drove trucks for a while, and I had a mentor, a guy named Hugh Reeves, who was a dispatcher at this trucking company in North Carolina that I worked for. And he took me in when he had no real reason to do so. I was really like clearly kind of lost and, in my own weird journey. And there was one moment that was really made a big, deep impression on me. I was on my own sort of hero's journey, my own odyssey. I was lost, whatever. And I kept screwing up. I would, deliver loads late and I would, get into accidents and stuff like that. And at one point, Hugh called me into his office and he, sat me down and he said, son, I don't know what sort of journey you're on in your own mind here, but this is a business. We are in business here and you are a representative of this business. Our job is to deliver loads and deliver them on time and not to screw up. And you cannot afford to be going through whatever emotional stuff you are in your head. You got to get it together because this is a business designed to make money. And that was like, one of those moments of, a slap in the face, thanks, I needed that type of thing. So he was a great mentor to me and I'm grateful to him to this day.
Well, yeah, he taught you how to be professional.
Yeah, he certainly gave me that idea. Anyway, it took me a long, long time to actually become a professional.
All right, so Telamon, former legionnaire, he gets basically voluntold by the Roman army to hunt down a courier who's carrying a letter from the Apostle Paul, because again, the Romans are freaking out that this movement is going to spread and bring down the empire. He meets the courier, and instead of turning the courier in, he has some sort of conversion, and we're not going to talk about what that conversion looked like, because that's the book. That's the we don't want to do that. But I mean, I'd like to use that his conversion, whatever that is, as a starting off point to discuss that what you're talking about, that switch from mercenary values, that philosophy of strife and dust, to a philosophy guided by love. Like, for you, like, what does a philosophy guided by love look like in an artist's life or a business person's life, just a man's life? And I'm guessing, does Telamon completely leave this philosophy of strife and dust behind and embrace this love philosophy?
He doesn't really. I think he integrates it. And there's a character that is central to this that we haven't mentioned. And it's a young girl who is a 9-year-old mute feral girl who is the daughter, or at least we think she's the daughter, of this suspected courier that's carrying the letter. We don't know where the letter is. It's all a mystery. And a bond begins to form between Telamon and this girl. And it's sort of a mysterious bond that they just seem to be simpatico with each other. And that in essence, she proves to be, of all the warriors in this story, and there's a bunch of them, she is the sort of the supreme warrior in terms of dedication and of ability to rise to an occasion. And so what happens with him, without giving away too much of the story, Telamon, is that he finds his heart opening to this girl, sort of like it did to David, to the boy who he takes on as his apprentice. And the story, as it goes along, this girl kind of proves herself over and over to him in one way or another. And he begins to not so much care for any message or any spiritual doctrine as he cares for her. And that's kind of where love kind of enters the picture. But he remains a warrior throughout the whole thing, and his warrior skills are set in the service of this love. And when the Apostle Paul talks about love in his letter to the Corinthians, he's not really talking about romantic love or the love that we feel for a brother or the love that we feel for a wife or for a family. He's talking about true Christian love at the highest level, love for the entire human race and for anyone who is suffering, anyone who is vulnerable, and love for the kingdom of heaven, the highest form of love, agape, really, in Greek. All these elements kind of come together as the story progresses: the letter, the girl, the bad guys, etc.
Well, let's tie it back into your previous nonfiction writing. Have you seen this sort of theme play out in your nonfiction writing as well?
Yes. I mean, I think that if we ask ourselves, let's say we want to be a writer, we want to be an entrepreneur, we want to be a songwriter, a filmmaker, or whatever, the first step is to kind of learn how to do that, to be a professional at that, to acquire those skills. But the next step, sort of the second half of our adventure, is what are we going to use those skills for? And in essence, if we think about, this is maybe getting a little too deep, Brett, but what the hell?
Let's do it.
If you think about the hero's journey in the Joseph Campbell sense, which is kind of a self-initiation that an individual goes through whatever suffering they have, whatever journeys they undergo, it always ends kind of like Odysseus coming back home to Ithaca. It always ends with a return home, kind of like Dorothy comes back to Kansas, or any hero sort of returns to where they started. But they return as a different person, and they return, this is according to the legend, with quote unquote a gift for the people, which comes from what they've learned on this journey, what their solitary suffering has brought them to. So the question then becomes, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an artist or whatever, what is my gift? That's the question that we all have to ask ourselves. If you're a writer, you say, well, what kind of books was I put here to write? If you're a songwriter, you say, what kind of music was I put here to produce? And when you get to that, the question really is, it's really a gift for the world. It's a gift for others. Whatever the song you're writing is meant maybe to bring somebody up from a depressed place, maybe to tell them that they're not alone in a situation of broken heart or frustrated life, whatever. But it is a gift, and it's a gift that's given out of love. And that's, I believe that is the whole meaning of our existence on this planet, that we kind of start off as children, as infants, where it's all me, give me my food, whatever. And even as we become adults, it's still a kind of a me thing, right? I want to achieve my goals. I want to make money. I want to establish an identity. I want to have a family, bump. But at some point, the question becomes, what am I doing all this for? And the answer, if we're going to evolve and not be stuck in some case of arrested development, is that we're giving something from our heart to the rest of the world. And if you're an artist, that's your art, that's your books, that's your music, whatever. If you're an entrepreneur, it's whatever business that you're putting forward. So I think that's how, if we are going to evolve, we evolve from fear to love, or from ego to love.
No, I like this because this ties in nicely with some other guests we've had on the podcast. Like David Brooks has that book, The Second Mountain, and then there's like Richard Rohr is this Franciscan monk.
Yeah, Richard Rohr. Yeah, David Brooks too. You're absolutely right. Those are definitely guys that I am tuned into, and I read all their stuff.
Right. So this idea is like, first the first part of life is like you're there to like construct a self, and it's very practical, hands-on. So like what you're talking about, you have to learn your craft, learn how to be a good writer, be a professional. And then at a certain point, you have to figure out, well, what's this for? And I'm curious, like, what do you think happens if you reverse those? Like, what if you try to like get that more higher level idea first before getting the practical level? Like, what happens if you are Telamon who's guided by love before you are Telamon, the mercenary man-at-arms?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I really have a real answer.
No,
I've never even thought about it. What were you going to say, Brett?
I don't know either. That's what I was thinking as you were talking. I was like, what would happen if you flipped the script?
It seems to me unnatural to do that, in that I don't know if that actually would work. I think sometimes someone at a young age might think that they are doing something purely out of love, but I'm not so, I would be skeptical if I met that person. Not to say that it doesn't happen or it isn't true, but I really don't know what the answer to that is. It just doesn't seem like things work that way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just riffing off the cuff here. I mean, they probably would be ineffective, right? Because you wouldn't have the skills. Like, you have this idea of what you want and like but like you don't have any skills to make it come to pass, to make it manifest itself. And so you just become, you're sort of impotent in a way.
Or even, I would say, beyond the idea of skill. I mean, I have a theory. One of my nonfiction books, I'm sure you know about, it's called The Artist's Journey. And the theory of the thesis of that book is that we have it's kind of like Richard Rohr, first half of life and second half of life, where that we have kind of two lives. And the first is our hero's journey. And when that's done, we go to our artist's journey, which is just like what Richard Rohr says. First, you establish the vessel that is yourself. And in the second half, you ask yourself, well, what do I fill the vessel with? But going back, what I meant to say was, in that first half of life, in that hero's journey, it's not just about the acquisition of skills, I don't think. I think it's also about a humbling, a deep humbling that happens to us. I think almost always the hero's journey ends with, or hits a point of what they would call in Hollywood an all is lost moment, a moment where we really hit bottom and then turn around from there. And it seems to me, if we going back to the Apostle Paul, it's the moment of his conversion on the road to Damascus, But so in other words, I think the first half of life is not just about acquisition of skills, but it's about being broken. It's about coming to a place where we say from our ego, I can't handle it. My ego is not enough. Living out of the rational mind, out of the ego, is not enough. And we sort of, at that point, and this becomes kind of religious or at least spiritual, we sort of surrender. We give up. If the analogy would be to say an alcoholic, they would say, in that moment that I have no control over alcohol and I have to call on a higher power. I give up. I can't do this by myself. So that I think the key to that is that once we're humbled in that way, then we're truly capable of love. Then we have empathy, not just for ourselves because we've been broken and we've seen how broken we can be, but it immediately applies to others. And we start to have compassion. Well, if I can fall apart like I've fallen apart, or if I've seen to my deepest self and I see how broken I am, then everybody else is on that same path. And my only real honorable way of dealing with others is with compassion and empathy and to try to help. And that's love. So I don't mean to get too deep here, Brett, but I think that's what it's about.
And you see that play out with Telamon. Like he has a moment definitely. Where he's broken.
He has that moment. Yes.
Yeah. and then also, and what I liked about the way you just do with the book is you show how that figuring out that second half of life stuff typically happens. And again, don't want to give it away. You got to read it in the papers if you want to see how that happens. But it's not the way people typically think it happens. It's not intellectual. It's not rational. It's something else.
No, it's definitely not. It's definitely happening on the soul level and not on the behavioral level or the psychological level for all of us when we come to that change. And if you think of a lot of stories have that same pattern, books or movies, where the hero hits a point of a dead end. You know, if I'm thinking of a movie, Cool Hand Luke, I don't know if you remember that with Paul Newman.
Oh yeah, of course.
Where he's on the chain gang, right? And, they finally break him, or he hits that moment where things turn around for him. So it's a common, I think, for all of us.
And I'm curious, have you already thought about like what happens to Telamon next? Did he escape this sort of eternal recurrence of being a warrior?
No, I haven't. In fact, I know I've got to, and I'm kind of scared to death of it. I know I haven't taken it all the way yet. So I'm waiting for the muse to touch down and help me on that one.
Well, Steven, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about the book and your work?
Just my website, which is just my name, Steven Pressfield, with Steven with a V. And that's got, all of the various stuff about it. But the book is on sale at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookstores, indies, everywhere.
All right. Well, Steven Pressfield, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, Brett, thank you very much. I'll do it again anytime on any subject.
All right. Thank you. My guest today was Steven Pressfield. He's the author of the book, A Man at Arms, available on Amazon.com and bookstores everywhere. You can find out more information about his work at his website, stevenpressfield.com. Also, check out our show notes at aom.is/manatarms, where you can find links to resources where we delve deeper into this topic.